The galaxy, in all its infinite wisdom and bureaucratic splendor, had developed what could generously be called a system. Less generously, one might describe it as a cosmic-scale protection racket disguised as diplomacy, complete with the kind of paperwork that would make a tax auditor weep tears of pure joy. At the center of this magnificent clusterfuck sat the Zephyrian Empire, a collection of beings who had mastered the art of making conquest sound like a neighborhood improvement project. Their latest press release, transmitted across 17 different subspace frequencies with all the subtlety of a supernova, described their comprehensive integration initiatives and cultural optimization programs. What they meant, of course, was that they showed up with enough firepower to glass a moon and politely suggested that resistance was not only futile but also terribly impolite. The Stellar Confederation, that shining beacon of galactic civilization, had responded to these developments with their usual decisive action, forming a committee. 3 committees, actually, because why solve a problem with one bureaucratic nightmare when you could create 3? The Committee for Diplomatic Resolution was currently debating the proper font size for their strongly worded letter, while the Committee for Military Assessment was still trying to figure out which end of a plasma rifle was the dangerous bit. Meanwhile, the Committee for Ethical Considerations had spent the last 6 months arguing about whether it was morally acceptable to use harsh language in their condemnation of systematic genocide. This was the state of galactic affairs when the Korvani made their mistake. Their terrible, horrible, no-good mistake of believing that civilization actually meant something. The Korvani were traitors, which in galactic terms meant they were the closest thing to pacifists the universe had produced since someone figured out how to weaponize quantum mechanics. They moved goods, services and information across star systems with the kind of efficiency that made economists write love poetry. Their ships were marvels of engineering designed for speed and cargo capacity, not combat. This made about as much sense as bringing a calculator to a knife fight, but the Korvani had always operated under the quaint assumption that reason and mutual benefit were stronger than plasma cannons. The Zephyrians had other ideas. Ambassador Vextai of the Korvani Trade Collective found himself in the uniquely unpleasant position of watching his homeworld burn while sitting in a comfortable chair aboard his diplomatic vessel. The irony was not lost on him that his species' dedication to peaceful resolution had earned them exactly 15 minutes of polite discussion before the integration process began. Perhaps, he said to his aide, a young Korvani named Zilneth, whose spots had turned a nervous shade of purple, we should have invested in something other than really fast cargo ships. The aide consulted his datapad with the kind of desperate hope usually reserved for lottery tickets and arranged marriages. Sir, the Confederation has responded to our distress call. Oh, wonderful. What did they say? They're forming a subcommittee to investigate the formation of a committee to assess the possibility of maybe sending a strongly worded letter. Vextai stared out at the orange glow that had recently been his civilization's capital city. I see. And how long will this process take? Approximately 18 standard months, sir, assuming the paperwork goes smoothly. Zilneth, yes, sir. Send out a general distress call, all frequencies, all sectors. If the civilized galaxy won't help us, maybe we can find someone less civilized. The message that went out was simple, desperate, and broadcast with the kind of raw honesty that made diplomatic corps everywhere break out in nervous sweats. It contained no flowery language, no careful political phrasing, and absolutely no concern for proper protocol. It was in essence a scream for help dressed up in subspace frequencies. This is Ambassador Vextai of the Korvani Trade Collective. Our worlds are burning, our people are dying. The Zephyrian Empire is systematically destroying our civilization while the galactic community holds meetings about holding meetings. We have 47 hours before our last colony falls. If anyone, anywhere, has the capability and willingness to help, please respond. We have nothing left to offer except our gratitude and our word that we will remember. The response was immediate and varied. The Stellar Confederation sent a formal acknowledgement that they had received the message and would process it according to proper channels. The hegemony of civilized worlds offered their thoughts and prayers, along with a helpful pamphlet on proper evacuation procedures. The Trade Federation expressed deep concern and announced the formation of a fact-finding mission that would arrive sometime next year. But from Sector 7G, a region of space so unremarkable that most galactic databases filed it under "Here be nothing interesting," came a different kind of response. Korvani vessel, this is Captain Elena Rodriguez of the Earth Defense Force ship Defiant. We got your message. Sit tight, help is on the way. The response was so refreshingly direct that Vextai actually checked his translation software twice. No diplomatic preamble, no requests for formal negotiations, no mention of proper channels or committee approvals. Just a simple statement of intent that sounded suspiciously like someone actually planning to do something. Sir Zilneth said, his spots now cycling through colors that didn't exist in any known emotional spectrum. I can't find any record of this Earth Defense Forces in our databases. What about their homeworld? This Earth, also nothing, sir. Sector 7G is listed as containing one star system with a single inhabited world. The inhabitants are classified as pre-contact civilization, sir. They're not supposed to have interstellar capability. Vextai considered this information while watching another of his colony worlds disappear in a brief bright flash. Zilneth, at this point, I'm willing to accept help from anyone who can count to 10 without forming a committee about it. Send our coordinates. What arrived 12 hours later defied several categories of galactic civilization, most principles of military logic, and at least 3 laws of physics that the Korvani had thought were fairly well established. The human fleet, if it could be called that, looked like someone had taken a shipyard, hit it with a hammer, and then decided the results were good enough for government work. The vessels were a mixture of designs that suggested their creators had either never heard of standardization, or had heard of it and decided it was for other people. Some ships were sleek and predatory, others looked like flying fortresses, and a few appeared to have been designed by someone who thought the best defense was to confuse the enemy into submission. But they all shared one characteristic that made Vextai's emotional spots cycle through a color spectrum that didn't have a name. They were absolutely bristling with weapons. Korvani vessel, came Captain Rodriguez's voice, now accompanied by video feed that showed a human female with the kind of expression usually worn by people who were about to explain exactly why someone else's day was about to get much worse. We're reading Zephyrian fleet elements moving toward your position. Please stand clear while we handle this. Captain Rodriguez, Vextai managed. You should know that the Zephyrian force consists of 67 capital ships, including 12 dreadnoughts. How many vessels do you have? The captain's expression shifted to what humans probably thought was reassuring, but which made Vextai's fight-or-flight instincts start voting for flight. We brought 15 ships for this one. Figured it would be good training for the new guys. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for the next 3 centuries, primarily as an example of what happened when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, and the immovable object turned out to be armed with enough firepower to rearrange local stellar geography. The Zephyrians, to their credit, followed all established protocols for fleet engagement. They formed proper battle lines, opened communications channels for the traditional exchange of threats and demands for surrender, and prepared to execute the kind of methodical destruction that had served them well across dozens of conquered systems. The humans responded by immediately doing everything wrong. Instead of forming battle lines, they scattered across 3 dimensions like someone had shaken a box of angry wasps. Instead of responding to communication attempts, they opened fire while Admiral Kethvar was still in the middle of his traditional pre-battle speech about the futility of resistance. And instead of targeting command ships first, as any civilized military force would do, they seemed to be shooting at whatever looked most interesting. What are they doing? Admiral Kethvar demanded of his tactical officer, a Zephyrian whose spots were cycling through the color spectrum of professional confusion. Sir, I believe they're improvising. Improvising what? Everything, sir. The human ships moved like they were piloted by beings who had never heard of proper military doctrine and wouldn't have cared if they had. They performed maneuvers that should have been impossible, survived hits that should have been fatal, and somehow managed to coordinate their attacks without seeming to communicate with each other at all. Captain Rodriguez's ship dove through the center of the Zephyrian formation while broadcasting what the Universal Translator helpfully identified as vintage Earth music, specifically something called Fortunate Son, at a volume that probably violated several noise ordinances. Her weapon system seemed to target ships based on some incomprehensible human logic that prioritized targets by their aesthetic offensiveness rather than their strategic value. Take out that ugly one with the fin things. Her voice crackled across the comm, apparently addressing her fleet. And someone please do something about that pretentious-looking command ship, the one with all the lights. You know the type. The Zephyrian admiral, who had spent considerable resources on those lights, took this as a personal insult, and ordered his entire fleet to focus fire on the human command vessel. This was a mistake roughly equivalent to trying to swat a hornet with a sledgehammer while standing in a hornet's nest. The human response was swift, decisive, and utterly lacking in anything resembling proportional response. Captain Rodriguez's ship shrugged off the incoming fire with shields that shouldn't have been able to exist on something that size, then proceeded to demonstrate why humans had apparently never heard of the concept of overkill. "All right, they want to play rough," Rodriguez announced to her fleet. "Jenkins, you know what to do." Somewhere in the human formation, presumably on a ship piloted by someone named Jenkins, someone pushed a button that shouldn't have existed. The result was a weapon discharge that lit up sensor screens across half the system, and made the local star briefly wonder if it had competition. When the energy dissipated, exactly half of the Zephyrian fleet was gone. Not destroyed, not disabled, just gone, as if they had been politely edited out of reality by someone with a very large eraser, and a complete disregard for the laws of conservation of mass. The remaining Zephyrian ships, faced with the choice between fighting beings who apparently treated the laws of physics as helpful suggestions rather than absolute rules, chose the better part of valor and engaged their faster-than-light drives with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for escaping event horizons. "Korvani vessel," Captain Rodriguez's voice came over the comm, sounding slightly out of breath but otherwise cheerful. "Threat neutralized. You folks okay over there?" Ambassador Vextai stared at his sensor readings, which insisted that the entire engagement had lasted exactly 17 minutes, and had resulted in the complete defeat of a force that had conquered half the sector. His emotional spots were cycling through colors that probably violated several decency laws. "Captain Rodriguez," he managed. "How? What did you just do?" "Tuesday," she replied, as if this explained everything. "Though I guess it's Wednesday for you folks, depending on your local rotation. Don't worry about the cleanup, we'll handle it." And they did. Over the next several days, human vessels began arriving in Korvani space carrying everything from medical supplies to construction equipment, to what appeared to be entire prefabricated cities. The humans approached disaster relief with the same cheerful disregard for conventional wisdom that they had shown in combat. Instead of following proper humanitarian protocols, they simply showed up and started fixing things. Instead of coordinating with local authorities, they set up their own command structure, and invited the Korvani to participate if they felt like it. Instead of conducting environmental impact studies before beginning reconstruction, they scanned the local ecosystem once, declared it probably fine, and began rebuilding with technology that seemed to violate several fundamental principles of engineering. "You know," Captain Rodriguez said to Ambassador Vextai during one of their daily coordination meetings, which consisted mainly of the human announcing what they were going to do, and the Korvani trying to keep up. "You folks had a pretty nice setup here. Trade routes, peaceful settlements, good infrastructure. Shame about the whole invasion thing." "Yes," Vextai agreed, watching human construction crews rebuild his homeworld's capital city with machinery that seemed to operate on the principle that if you couldn't fix something with enough power tools, you weren't using enough power tools. "Captain, if I may ask, why did you respond to our distress call? Your species isn't even supposed to have interstellar travel." Rodriguez laughed, a sound that the universal translator rendered as something between amusement and barely contained violence. "Yeah, well, we've been out here for a while now, exploring, you know, meeting the neighbors. And let me tell you, the neighborhood's been pretty disappointing." "How so?" "Well, take your Stellar Confederation. Nice enough folks, very polite, great at organizing meetings, terrible at actually doing anything useful. Then you've got empires like the Zephyrians, who seem to think that conquest is some kind of cosmic public service. And don't get me started on the Trade Federation. But surely there are other species that look," Rodriguez interrupted. "Here's the thing about humans. We've spent our entire history dealing with bullies, tyrants, and people who think might makes right. So when we finally get out into the galaxy and find out that the same crap is happening on a cosmic scale, well," she gestured toward the construction site that had been a ruined city that morning. "Let's just say we have some strong opinions about that sort of thing." News of the Korvani incident spread through the galaxy with the kind of speed usually reserved for natural disasters and really good gossip. The official reports, filed through proper channels, and subjected to appropriate review processes, described the events as an unexpected military intervention by an unknown force resulting in the cessation of Zephyrian expansion activities in the Korvani sector. The unofficial reports, spread through the kind of communication networks that governments pretended didn't exist, told a different story. They spoke of a species that had emerged from nowhere with technology that made galactic superpowers look like they were still trying to figure out fire. They described beings who treated interstellar warfare like a minor inconvenience, and approached diplomacy with all the subtlety of a plasma torpedo to the face. Most importantly, they mentioned that these humans were apparently taking requests. The next distress call came from the Million Republic, a collection of peaceful agricultural worlds that had made the mistake of refusing to pay protection fees to the hegemony of civilized worlds. The call after that came from a mining collective that had discovered something the Trade Federation wanted and couldn't afford to share. Then came calls from refugee fleets, isolated colonies, and anyone else who had found themselves on the wrong end of galactic civilization's protection racket. The humans responded to each call with the same cheerful efficiency they had shown with the Korvani. They arrived, assessed the situation, applied overwhelming force in the most direct manner possible, and then helped clean up the mess with technology that seemed to operate on the principle that any problem could be solved if you just threw enough engineering at it. 6 months after the Korvani incident, the galaxy had developed what political scientists would later describe as a new equilibrium. The Stellar Confederation was still holding meetings, but now those meetings included urgent discussions about the human situation. The various empires and hegemons that had spent centuries carving up the galaxy found themselves suddenly reluctant to expand into sectors where human ships had been spotted. The Trade Federation had attempted to open diplomatic relations with humanity, sending a delegation armed with enough paperwork to deforest a small moon. The humans had responded by sending Captain Rodriguez to the meeting with a single aide and a handwritten note that read, "Be nice to people or we'll make you stop. Signed, Earth." The delegation was still trying to figure out what kind of diplomatic framework could be built around such a document. Ambassador Vextai found himself in the unusual position of serving as an unofficial liaison between humanity and what remained of galactic civilization. It was a role that involved a lot of translation, both linguistic and cultural, as various species tried to understand beings who seemed to operate on principles that weren't covered in any diplomatic manual. The thing is, he explained to a gathering of representatives from 17 different worlds, all of whom had received human assistance in recent months, they don't seem to want anything. Everyone wants something, insisted Councillor Yethmar of the Stellar Confederation, whose spots were displaying the particular shade of green that indicated bureaucratic frustration. Territory, resources, political influence, trade advantages. There has to be something. I've asked, Vextai replied. Captain Rodriguez said, and I quote, "We just want people to stop being jerks to each other." When I asked for clarification on the term jerks, she provided a list that included most of the major powers in the galaxy. The gathering fell silent as they contemplated this information. It was, by all established standards of galactic politics, completely insane. Species didn't develop interstellar capability just to police the galaxy for free. They didn't build fleets capable of dismantling empires just to help strangers. They certainly didn't do it without demanding something in return. Perhaps, suggested Representative Kolnath of the Mining Collective, they're planning some kind of long-term conquest strategy. Build goodwill, establish influence, then strike when we're dependent on them. Vextai considered this theory while watching a human construction crew rebuild a space station using tools that seemed to violate at least 4 different scientific principles. I asked Captain Rodriguez about that too. She laughed for approximately 3 minutes, and then said, "Do you have any idea how much paperwork galactic conquest would involve? We'd rather just shoot the bad guys and go home." The representatives exchanged glances that conveyed the universal sentiment of beings who had discovered that their entire understanding of interstellar relations might be fundamentally flawed. "So what do they want from us?" Councillor Yethmar asked. According to Captain Rodriguez, they want us to not be jerks. I believe this translates to don't conquer each other, don't exploit the weak, and try to solve problems with conversation before resorting to violence. and if we refuse. Vextai gestured toward the sensor readings that showed human patrol ships maintaining regular routes through 17 different star systems. I suspect they'll explain their position more forcefully. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the galaxy's most peaceful solution to interstellar conflict had come from what was apparently its most militarily capable species. The humans had achieved what centuries of diplomacy, trade agreements, and strongly worded letters had failed to accomplish. They had made being a galactic bully a genuinely dangerous profession. The Stellar Confederation, faced with the reality that someone was finally doing their job better than they were, had quietly begun restructuring their military along human-inspired principles. This mainly involved less committee formation, and more actually shooting at people who deserved it. The various empires and hegemons that had carved up the galaxy found themselves adapting to a new reality where expansion through conquest had become suddenly impractical. Some adapted by focusing on legitimate trade and diplomacy. Others adapted by discovering that their military budgets were better spent on infrastructure and social programs than on building fleets that would get disintegrated by humans who treated warfare like a hobby. A few stubborn powers attempted to continue business as usual. The Dominion of Eternal Glory, for instance, had launched a police action against a coalition of independent worlds, confident that no one would interfere with their sovereign right to conquer weaker neighbors. They had not factored humans into their calculations. The Dominion's Grand Fleet, assembled over decades and representing the pinnacle of their military might, met the human response in the Kepler Nebula. The engagement lasted exactly 8 minutes, and resulted in what human military reports described as a comprehensive educational experience for the Dominion regarding the practical applications of superior firepower. The Dominion surrendered unconditionally, and spent the next several months learning about human concepts like war crimes tribunals, and reparations payments. Their former territories were returned to their original inhabitants, along with detailed instructions on how to contact humanity, if anyone else tried to bother them. Word spread. Captain Rodriguez found herself in the peculiar position of being simultaneously the most feared and most respected person in the galaxy. Her ship had become a kind of mobile embassy, traveling from system to system and solving problems with a combination of overwhelming firepower, and what she called aggressive diplomacy. "You know," she said to Ambassador Vextai during one of their regular conversations. "This wasn't exactly what we had in mind when we first left Earth." "What did you have in mind?" "Oh, the usual stuff. Explore strange new worlds, meet interesting alien civilizations, maybe find some good recipes and some decent music. Instead we find out the galaxy's full of the same kind of jerks we've been dealing with for millennia, just with better technology." Vextai's spots cycled through what humans had learned to recognize as thoughtful contemplation. "And so you decided to do something about it?" "Well, yeah, I mean, what else were we going to do? Go home and pretend we didn't know that perfectly nice people were getting conquered by space fascists, while galactic civilization held meetings about it? It was," Vextai reflected, "a remarkably simple philosophy for such a complex species. The humans had looked at the galaxy, identified the problem, and applied the most direct solution available. The fact that their solution involved enough firepower to rearrange solar systems was almost beside the point." "Captain," he said, "what happens when the galaxy—" Rodriguez considered this question while watching her crew conduct what they called routine maintenance on weapons systems that could probably disintegrate a small moon. "I guess we'll find something else to do. Maybe explore those unknown sectors out past the rim. I hear there are some interesting civilizations out there." The thought of humans discovering new civilizations to protect was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant that species like the Korvani would never again face extinction alone. Terrifying because it meant that humanity's definition of neighborhood watch apparently extended to the entire galaxy. But perhaps most remarkable of all was how quickly everyone had adapted to the new normal. The galactic community had spent centuries accepting that might made right, that the strong preyed on the weak, and that civilization was really just a polite word for organized exploitation. The arrival of a species that had both the might and the inclination to make right what had been made wrong had fundamentally altered that equation. The galaxy had learned that there was something more frightening than the most ruthless conqueror, or the most efficient military machine. Someone who showed up looked around and said, "This isn't right,"
and then had both the power and the moral certainty to do something about it. 18 months after that first desperate distress call from the Korvani, Ambassador Vextai found himself attending a ceremony that would have been unthinkable under the old Galactic Order. Representatives from 47 different species had gathered to sign what they called the Mutual Defense and Non-Aggression Pact, a document that essentially formalized what had already become the new reality: don't start fights, don't pick on people weaker than you, and if you need help, ask nicely. The humans had agreed to serve as guarantors of the agreement, which meant that violating it would result in a visit from Captain Rodriguez, and whatever ship she happened to have handy that week. You know, Vextai said to Captain Rodriguez as they watched the signing ceremony. A year ago, most of these species wouldn't have been in the same star system without trying to conquer each other. Yeah, well, Rodriguez replied. Amazing how civilized people can be when they know someone's watching, and there it was, the new Galactic Order in a nutshell. Civilization, it turned out, wasn't about technology or philosophy, or elaborate governmental structures. It was about having someone around who was willing and able to tell the bullies to knock it off. The irony, which was lost on no one who had lived through the transition, was that the galaxy's salvation had come from the species everyone would have dismissed as primitive barbarians, if they had bothered to notice them at all. The humans had brought peace to the galaxy not through superior wisdom or advanced philosophy, but through the simple expedient of being the biggest, scariest thing in the neighborhood, and using that power to protect the innocent rather than exploit them. It was, Vextai reflected as he watched Captain Rodriguez explain to his Ephirian trade delegation exactly why their economic integration proposals weren't going to be accepted. A remarkably human solution to the problem of galactic civilization. The galaxy had called for help, and help had answered. The fact that help had arrived armed with enough firepower to rearrange local stellar geography, and an attitude that treated interstellar diplomacy like a combination of neighborhood watch and cosmic pest control, was just a bonus. After all, someone had to keep the jerks in line.